is Courtney Terry, and I work for AI, and I believe most of you know who AI is already. But just in case you don't, we are a quality control and supply compliance company, and we work with brands and retailers to secure and manage their global supply chains. We're in 85 countries, and that's every continent, with the exception of Antarctica, yet. So, having such a wide reach, that also means we have a clear view of the big picture when it comes to global supply chains. And in this big picture, ethical compliance is becoming an increasingly prominent element. 10 years ago, the very idea of corporate social responsibility was still largely looked at as a feel-good, nice to have, or even possibly a PR gimmick. Today, the truth cannot be farther. It is the year 2017, and every brand and every company is subjected to closer scrutiny than ever before. The following questions are being asked by brands every day by retailers, NGOs, and most importantly, consumers. What is the state of human rights in your supply chain? How big is the product's environmental footprint? Do you provide safe working conditions for your workers? The time of zero accountability is truly over. The words of the day are transparency and sustainability. That said, every one of us knows that ethical and sustainable supply chains are not built overnight. The problems that we must tackle are incredibly complex, and the world is more globalized than ever. Political decisions made on one side of the planet can reverberate through your entire value chain. Things like climate change, the refugee crisis, and many more are reshaping the global landscape of procurement as we know it. For problems of such scale, there will never ever be a quick fix or a silver bullet. Finding the right solution takes time, trial and error, and customization. Something that works for one brand might not work for another brand. And even then, something that works for one product might need to be changed for other products or countries or regions. This is exactly why we're all gathered here today. It is up to us to come together and bring our individual strengths to the table, share experiences, and multiply the sum of our collective knowledge. At AI, we have thousands of auditors and inspectors visiting factories every single day. Now that's a tremendous amount of data on the ground, and we would like to take this opportunity to share our insights. We also have with us our compliance professionals, Ines from CCR and Vera from Oulala. We all hope that you will come away from this conference with some fresh perspectives and actionable ideas. Solutions that you can take back to your company, integrate in your supply chain, and tailor to fit your business. Ideas that you can further progress upon and bring to the next gathering like this to share with your colleagues. Because no one person or company has all the answers. Supply chain compliance is and always will be a work in progress. But let's make one thing clear, that business as usual does not work anymore. But we must do better. We can do better. So let's talk about it. On that note, I'd like to bring our first speaker to the stage, Gabriel from AI. He is our Audit Service Manager. Please welcome Gabriel.
Thank you very much, Courtney, for this introduction. So, very happy to be able to talk about the current status of ethics and social accountability in the supply chain. So before we start, I just wanted to have a quick overview of what we are going to talk about. As Courtney was saying, CSR is a topic which started less than 30 years ago, relatively new compared to the rest of the industry. Started with scandals, with newspaper issues highlighted, going to an evolution where it was more about corporate communication, more about PR, then evolving quickly into very strong approach, including audits and including an approach like comply or die, where high requirements was imposed and a top-down approach to suppliers. And then evolving again over time to a more cooperative approach, which is coming now. So this is something which is in a very short period of time has evolved a lot in terms of what was expected and what it's including. What we want to share today is based on our database, based on the 1,000 audits and hundreds of audit programs and CSR programs that we work on with our clients, what are the data, what are the information that we get, and what we recommend as tips and good practices to make efficient CSR programs. So quickly, we are going to go through, well, ethical auditing, the facts and figures that we get from Asia inspection. We are going to talk about the challenges that we met and that supply chain and CSR met in 2016 and that they might meet again in 2017. And based on that, we are going to provide some tips, hopefully useful, on what we think are the most efficient approach for a CSR program. So the first figures we wanted to share is about the geographical performance of factories. So just a quick methodology explanation. We classified in 3 levels, traffic light system, red, amber, and green. Red can be understood as high risk, amber as medium risk, and green as low risk. So the general information, as you can see on the overall approach, is that we have almost 65% of factories which shows medium or high risk. So there is still a lot of things to do and to improve on the supply chain. In terms of trends, we see that China is slightly lower than average, with a trend that we saw last year on improvement globally if we compare from 2015 to 2016. Some other countries, we can see, for example, Pakistan or Bangladesh, which are increasing in terms of volume and activities there, show actually lower results and higher risk level. This is also interesting, data which is not here, but to notice that some new destination countries like Africa, where we started to have more and more audits, had a very stunning 0% of green factories in audits last year. A second interesting data set is about the performance by industry. So we classified by big categories of industry. Here also what you can see on the slide is related to the results and the risk level by industry. What we see is from audits is, for example, that construction and mechanical items end up with high level of red result and high level of risk, which can be linked also to the fact that these are more B2B activities and which have usually less mature CSR programs than consumer goods. We see also that electrical and electronic products are still showing a high level of risk, and also with a trend of decreasing, so rather negative trend on the electrical and electronics industry, which can be also linked to the increase of labor cost, for example, in some countries, and which link to issues, namely on working hours or wages payments that are increasing. We also see that some industries like printing and packaging tend to have higher results. Actually, this also can be linked to the fact that, for example, on the printing industry, we talk about less labor-intensive activities, and then we have less issues that we can observe. Finally, a third set of figures that we wanted to share is about the topics where we find biggest issues over our audits. So here again, in terms of methodology, we use a score out of 10, 10 being the best score, and these are the global average that we get for these sections. Waste management is actually the place where we have the lowest average score, which is related to the fact that it's usually a more new topic for factories. The regulation is also evolving a lot, and we see a lower level of awareness about the requirements and what is expected from the suppliers that we audit. We see that working hours, wages, and benefits remain also a topic where there is risk. Here also with a trend year on year of decreasing score, so a rather negative trends on working hours and wages. This includes what is normal working hours, overtime hours, payment of the minimum salaries, living wages, but also social insurance and benefits, which is, for example, in China, a big topic. And here also we can see an impact somehow in what we see of the increase of labor cost, and which links sometimes to bad practices to offset this increase in the cost in the factories. We see that health and safety and hygiene remains also a big topic, with here a trend to improve over the time, so which is quite positive on this one. Still, usually more in reaction of what has been asked and sometimes of audit results. If it can bring an improvement, it's always something which is positive. Now we still also see as root cause a lower level of awareness of the risk-based approach for health and safety, and of the notions of risk assessment and what action should be taken to mitigate the risk. The remaining two topics, child labor, labor practices. Labor practices include discriminations, harassment, freedom of association, forced labor. So these are topics which have average score which are relatively high. However, the reason is that usually it's either compliance or critical issues which are found in factories on these topics. So these are the most critical problems that can be found in the supply chain. Hopefully, and that's good that we don't find as many issues as on health and safety, but as you can see, that's still existing and still need to be very thoroughly checked, because these are the very critical issues. So to summarize what we saw from our data sets, we have geographical performance, which shows different results in different areas and regions. So this is interesting information to include, maybe not sufficient alone, because we also see that different industries may have different trends, and that the issues within CSR are very multiple. So there is something interesting in the analysis of the data, but they need to be cross-checked together by topics, by industry, and by geographical location to go to the good direction and to focus and define an important CSR program. So this granularity of the data is a challenge that can exist as well to define an efficient CSR approach. There are a lot of other challenges that are existing, and we would like to now talk about these existing challenges that we've seen. But before we go on, we would like to ask the people here in the room to participate through a small survey, as Courtney was explaining. So using the website of Slido to connect and to answer with your mobile phone to this question. So as you can see on the left screen here, you can join on the website, tap the hashtag, and you will be able to choose an answer and give your answer and submit, and we will see the results in the room. We will give you 2 minutes to do that. I think it's not moving anymore on 42 answer. 43, yeah, good. 48, okay, great. Let's get 1 more minute to complete it. Interesting answers, actually, that we see factory transparency, so coming on the top. Budget limitation, coming on the second, which was also unexpected answers. Too many standards, lack of improvement. Yeah, that's everything is around higher than 30% of the people. So we see that there is multiple challenges actually in this topic. So instead of just commenting here, we were expecting, I would say, this kind of answers. So I'm going to give more to switch back to this this side of the screen, and we are going to talk about the challenges. What we classified these ones, first challenge that we classified would be what we called around the reliability of the data. Is the data gathered reliable? And under this one, we include coaching, for example. What we see as a trend during our audits is that the project and the CSR programs and the expectations become more known at suppliers level, for example, and there is some bad practices of trying to get prepared or to coach, for example, workers in order to give answers which are expected by brands and by auditors rather than sharing the actual information. Typically, we see that through the workers' interviews that we perform, for example, during audits, where we found that there is some coaching activities and that it became, we need to be more innovative, and the third parties are becoming more innovative to have efficient interviews. So I think what's important, for example, is that the time of prepared questionnaires, yes/no questions, this cannot be used anymore. We need innovative questions to talk to the workers and to get open questions to get actual information. Second challenge, which is included here, we didn't get any any answer about integrity as well. I'm not sure if it was included in the survey, but yeah, we are in an industry which is also a high-risk industry in terms of integrity. So this is including bribery. This is including also conflict of interest. And here, what is very important is to select the partners, suppliers, third parties, all included, who have very strong enforcement and policies on integrity and field implementation. That's really important on this point. Finally, the last point, and which came as first answer actually in the survey, is about the transparency. So we see a trend of more than 15% of our audits last year, which ended up with cannot be verified, namely for working hours and wages, which is usually meaning that we cannot get any evidence or enough evidence to confirm what are the actual situation in the factories. This can be related to several topics, including potentially, as everybody knows in the room, the challenges that we face, double booking, fake documents. The root cause that we see behind that is usually a lack of understanding or misunderstanding of what are the expectations of these audits and why these audits are being done. So these three answers were more usually, I think, from, if you answered these three answers first, usually it's coming from brands and retails. The next answers are also more on supplier factory side. This is also challenges, is audit fatigue that we see at the bottom, or the too many standards. We see that on the industry now there are many standards, sometimes very similar but not aligned, which creates a kind of feeling sometimes at supplier side about misunderstanding of what's the expectation and what are the differences between different standards. We have a quote here also about audit fatigue. So this is an extreme example of 98 audits in 1 year in the same factory. So the question also, and that's what we are going to discuss in the next step, is, isn't it also a way to refocus the audits? One of the examples could be on going to lower tier suppliers, tier 2, tier 3, rather than always re-auditing the same people, or to do it more efficiently to avoid this audit fatigue, which is creating a lack of involvement and a lack of buy-in also in the programs from the suppliers. So to summarize, we see from here that there is different challenges. If you are on brand, retailer side, budget, of course, is one of them as well, important one. And if you are on supplier or factory side, the challenges are also here and are different. What is clear is that it can create sometimes a feeling of what does it bring to the suppliers? What's the value for compliance? Or how to bring improvement, how to avoid the lack of improvement that can occur. What we see from our database and from our audits is that when we do efficient audit programs with our clients, we have usually less than 5% of red results on re-audits after remediation, and when there is some remediation and a full program taking place. And we also see a trend, actually, which is interesting on the result in quality side of Asia inspection, on the failed inspection, and on the result of CSR, which match with each other. So we tend to have the same trend. The best performers in CSR usually are also the best performers in quality. So there is a clear correlation, actually, between the general compliance and other topics such as quality. What's the common things between these is that there is a strong CSR program, a well-developed and strongly implemented CSR program in the companies. So in the next step, and hopefully it can be useful, what we are going to do is to try to give some information about what are the strong and the best practices that we see that leads to this improvement. So first of all, a good question is to understand what's the final objective of the CSR program, and why are we doing these audits? Why are we verifying this condition? Is it corporate communication, as we said? Is it to control the risk on the supply chain, purely risk control? Is it to bring some improvement in the labor conditions on the supply chain? There is some questions to be asked on that. What is sure is that in 2017, the final consumers, they want to know what's the condition in the supply chain. They want to understand. What is sure also is that purely communication or PR programs are not possible anymore, because there are watchdogs, there are people to make sure that there is a genuine interest for CSR. So maybe what we would recommend and what we see as the best practices is when the CSR program is aiming and targeting at bringing improvement on the supply chain, and also that CSR is now a boardroom level topic, and it comes at strategic levels in the brands and in the industry, and it's helping to take decisions. Second thing, we see the risk-based approach as being interesting approach and the most efficient approach for the CSR programs. First of all, mapping of the suppliers. So an open question is to know also in 2017 if it's possible to, for a brand or for a retail to not know where the products are being manufactured. This is, I think, something that we see that it's not possible anymore. We need to know, and it's the time of transparency, the products need to be identified. We need to map the supply chain. And this is including lower tier of the supply chain, tier 2, tier 3. This is really the first step to understand. Once you know the mapping of your supply chain, then what are the risks on the supply chain? So identify different risks. That's where the data can be used, and the data sets that we presented can be used to see, depending on your industry, depending on your products, you have different risks. And you need to identify what are these risks. And then the programs need to be very adaptive and evolving. We had last year terrorism, refugee crisis. This is creating a population which is much more, where there will be some problems, CSR issues. So the audit program needs to take this into account, and the CSR program needs to take this into account to be efficient. It cannot just be something fixed and not evolving according to what is happening in the world. Then the key steps is to gather data. It's to understand and gather information and data. So how to get accurate data? What we said, internet can be a source, newspaper can be a source, audits, that's a source which have the interest to be on-site with a methodology of interview, observation, document review, and which has the advantage to be scalable. But there is also the possibility to do, we see investigation and undercover work. We see NGOs doing that and can get informations which are a different set of information, not the same kind of information that you get from audits, but which can be also useful for the CSR program. Worker survey, we have Ulula and CCR CSR, we're going to talk about these topics as well. This is also another set of data, information from workers' perspective, which are different from what we get from audits. They are complementary, and actually the idea is to use the best tool based on the risk between all the tools existing, which one will give me the best information and the information I need. And finally, the last step, which is maybe the most important if we consider the objectives which was defined, is to lead the improvement. Lead the improvement means two prerequisites: transparency and cooperation. Transparency here, we can also use it. We saw transparency here, factory transparency, but we would like to emphasize the importance of transparency in two sides. That means it's also very important to share why, what's the objective of the program, what are the expectations, why the data are getting informed. So what's very important is also that when suppliers or factories are getting audited, let's say, they know what's the expectation and why is it going on. That's how you avoid transparency issue in the other side. Finally, follow-up on finding is very important. That's the key step. It can be through documentary verification. It can be going back on site. It can be through remediation with the relevant people. But making sure that any findings, any issues found is followed up and is improved. Then measure the improvement to see what are the improvements which have been achieved. And the reward section is more about rewarding those who take improvements. So what we see is that we see now in many of our programs that most likely, it's a question, but is the best a factory which starts in red and reaching a green level is usually better and might be a better partner than an amber factory which remain at the same level and is not ready to involve or get involved into the programs. So to conclude quickly, this is a simple step, but might be actually more complicated to put in place, of course. But what we see as the common topics of the efficient CSR programs, we have the mapping, we have the risk identification, get the data, gather all the data as possible to make sure that we identify the risk, lead the improvement, measure the improvement. These are the steps that we see in every CSR program we work with, which are successful. And then, of course, repeat after time. It's not a one-shot thing. Audit is one tool. That's why we have been referring all the time of this presentation of CSR program, but it's not a magic tool. It's one of the tools existing, but it needs also to include remediation, improvement, training. So the idea is to select the relevant actors, see who are the best people according to their expertise in order to reach these different steps and reach these objectives. Finally, to conclude on that, we can come back to corporate communication, but more on if there is improvements which are led, if there is improvements which are reached, then corporate communication become more, of course, easy, because that's something that can be very easily shared and also something to be, I would say, proud of to share with everybody the improvements and what has been improved in the life of the people on the supply chain thanks to the audit program.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. It's very insightful. Next to the stage, I'd like to invite Ines. She's working from CCR CSR. Please welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to AI to this event and giving me the opportunity to share a little bit of our work. I am from CCR CSR. It's a bit of a tongue twister. It stands for the Center for Child Rights and Corporate Social Responsibility. And just to give you a really 1-minute introduction on what we're doing is we basically meet with companies and try to assess together with them what is their impact on children in general, children's rights, where do they potentially have risk to impact children negatively through their operations, and where are opportunities where companies can use their leverage to have a positive impact on children. Practically, this then often leads to supply chain programs, supply chain activities or changes within supply chain management to obviously avoid, prevent and remediate child labor, to create better systems for working parents within the supply chains, but also to create systems to protect and support juvenile workers, so workers that are working within the factories or forestry operations, etc., that are under the age of 18, but in a legal working age. So that's kind of the free area. So very quick introduction on what we're doing. Now today I'm going to talk a little bit about child labor and how this relates to some of other kind of tendencies or observations we made, and how we can basically mitigate child labor risks by working with migrant parents and youth in our supply chain. So it tries to bring this kind of compliance issue together with a few social issues that we are observing. So maybe to start with a couple of numbers on migration in Asia, and that's where we're working. So CSR is working in China, Myanmar, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Bangladesh at the moment. And we've seen in all those countries strong labor movements. They can be domestic labor movements, as in China, where we have 247 million migrants that moving from the rural areas to the industrial areas, mostly in the east coast of China. This leads to an estimate of 61 million children that grow up without at least one of their parents. The number of those who grow up without both of their parents is lower. It's about an estimated half of them, but definitely has a big impact on many children in China and the way they're growing up. But we have very similar, similar tendencies in Vietnam, where we have around 12 million domestic migrants. In Malaysia, we have between 3 to 6 million foreign migrants coming from Bangladesh, coming from Nepal. About half of them are illegal. That's why the number is not very clear. Even in Bangladesh, for example, it's interesting to see that we have this movement towards the cities. Often the families move together, but we also do have a similar situation where some children stay behind. But currently, there are about 300 to 400 new people moving to Dhaka every year at the moment, and creating a Islamization of Dhaka that it hasn't seen before. And so the whole 63% of the growth of Dhaka city is based on domestic migration. It's not a natural growth of population. So just this in the background about how huge those migrant movements are and how many people are moving from one place to another in order to get work, and a lot of times this is work within the supply chains of our companies. And then on the other side, and we saw a little bit of data from AI on child labor. This is data that we gathered last year with about 537, I might get the last number wrong, of auditors that we interviewed and asked them, how many child labor cases were you confronted with in the last 2 years? The reason we did this survey with auditors was that we felt when we meet those auditors, they have such a big resource, or a big source of experiences and stories that we often don't necessarily find then in the annual reports of companies. And so we really wanted to go out and see what are their experiences, what do they see and observe. And despite having heard, and we are working on child labor, so many companies have working with us, so if they have a child labor case, they call us, so we do see, I would say, an over-representation of the issue, because that's what our job is. Despite that, I was really surprised about this number, because so from these auditors, for example, the average, what the auditors said, in the last 2 years, they were dealing with 2.8 cases or suspected cases of child labor in China. And then in China, it was 1.9 that was confirmed. So I was rather surprised, because these auditors are really from, there were auditors from standard auditing companies, like SGS, Elevate. There were auditors from international brands such as Adidas and Nike, etc., where you think, they weren't like where we've been working in those factories for a long time. So I was actually expecting a lower number to come back. And it really came very clear to us that, and that was kind of early last year, that child labor is still a very important issue, because also, as Gabriel just mentioned, there is no gray zone often in that situation. It's not about whether you have 1 or 2 children or whether you have 10 children in your factory. The 2 children or the 1 child is actually enough to make this a very critical issue for most of the brands who are working, or most of the companies that are working in those factories. So that's just a little bit of background. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and really throughout last year in particular, I think we came to see a lot of the the new emerging risks that are relating to child labor. And I want to point out 3 risks in particular. One is what we call children on the work floor. I will tell you more about this. The second one will be the complex and opaque supply chains that we are dealing with. Unfortunately, often our supply chains are much bigger than we think they are, and we only know about the first tier or maybe the second tier, but there's a lot of things we don't know about. And the third one, which is more of a social issue, is the school dropouts, which are a real drive for potential child labor in our supply chain. So children in factory production areas. This picture we made last year in, I think it was early August, in a factory. 2 weeks before that, just passed a very standardized and recognized, not AI, audit. Because the factory was smart enough to know that they would tell the workers to make sure that the children are locked up in the dormitory while the auditors were there. So none of the auditors saw that. However, when a quality controller from another company got back 2 weeks later, he saw that when we went into the factory, we saw at least 16 kids on the factory. Obviously, this kid is not working there. He's just with his dad. It's summer vacation, school is out. And the factory manager, I think for understandable reasons, said, look, I can't have them locked up in dormitories all day. That's not human. I can't do that. So I don't like it. My supervisors don't like it. It's distracting the parents. It's lowering our efficiency, but that's basically what I have to do. And this is really a phenomenon that we have seen a lot and something that's coming up, and we see that is in audit reports, etc. That in particular in China, there are more families starting to move with their children. There are changes within the hukou system in China. In certain areas of China, there's more opportunities, which is a good thing for families to move together. But it also leads to the fact that the industrial zones and factories that were built for single, maybe married people who stay there for two years suddenly come with their families. And obviously there's no daycare, there's no childcare around. And linking this to child labor, these are the risks. Because obviously the 2 or 3-year-old might not get involved, but the 9 and 10-year-old will get involved. And I would do that if I was in that situation as a mom and I had my 10-year-old there, just tell him, well, start helping, other than just bothering me. And so these kids started to work in the factory. They weren't hired by the factory, they had no contracts, but they helped to increase their parents' piece rate through that. And so it seemed to the logical solution. And as you can see, this is obviously something that most of, I guess, your companies would not want to see in the factories. It does, from a child rights perspective, create huge risks for children. It's not healthy for small children to be on a factory floor for 8 or 10 hours a day. There's a very high level of dust, for example, in these factories. There's dangerous machines, there's cutting machines, etc. So it's definitely not the place to be. Now, I'm not only going to talk about the risks, but a little bit on how we're trying and how companies are working in mitigating those risks. And so one of the things that we've really seen, that companies started to consider this more, I mean, there's one simple way to solve this. You can just go and put a couple of really strong guards at the gate of your factory and make sure that the children do not come into the factory. That's probably a fairly easy solution, but you might actually then have the situation that this is not always happening, and you might have actually a nice factory manager who thinks like, I can't do that. That's not nice, because we talked to parents this summer who the year before, and last summer they didn't have to do it, and I think they don't have to do it this summer because they had other opportunities, but the year before, they locked up their children every day during summer vacation in their dormitories or in their apartments. I talked to this mom who said, last summer my son was 4 years old. Every morning at 8 o'clock or 7:30, I would turn on the TV, lock the door, run out. I run out home over lunch to make sure he eats some lunch. I'll lock him up again in the afternoon, and if I had to work overtime, my 4-year-old son was by himself until 9 o'clock. This woman had lost her husband a year earlier, and it was just immense to see the pressure workers must be under in order to deal for her healthcare. And so we have really seen companies who started to think about that and say, okay, just putting guards at the gate is not going to solve it. We need to do something else. One thing is that we train parents and migrant parents together with those companies and to really take their situations into consideration. We work with the factories to make sure they know about the situation, and that's something you can really include into your systems. You can ask factories, collect that data about your workers. Make sure you know who of your workers are parents. Make sure you know the average age or the approximate age of those children, and understand whether they live with their children or whether they are separate from them children, from their children. And then you can react on the specific needs that this will give, that this will create within the factory. And if you have a high population of migrant workers who live with their children, you will know you have this risk of having children on the work floor. Because most of the migrant workers don't have a big family setting around. They don't have 3 aunts and a grandma who can take care of the kids. So they're very much on their own. And that's when this situation occurs most often. We've also started and have seen companies more and more investing in what we call factory child-friendly spaces, or in a project that we've started last year and is ongoing with the ICTI Care from the Toy Industry Association. They call it factory family-friendly spaces, another tongue twister. But basically what it does is that we train and capacity build factories to create centers like this one in their factories that, depending on the need, could be a summer, open in summer when kids are out of school. They can be open over weekends. We're working with factories that open them every day after school. They're kind of homework centers. They call them 4:30 schools. So where the kids can go after 4:30. What we're really doing or trying to achieve here is that we're not sending an NGO to go and open this center, but we capacity building the factory to do it on their own, to also find ways to do it with relatively low costs. So we're creating volunteering systems within the factory. So normally factories hire 1 or 2, depending on the size, professional teachers, but then all the other staff is staff volunteering, for example, from the HR department, from the admin department. And we've really it's not always easy, there's some obstacles, but we've had fantastic results of factories doing that, increasing worker retention, increasing worker satisfaction, and obviously giving a safe space to the factory. This picture, by the way, where you can see in the back, there's this kind of hole in the wall, which is now filled with toys for the kids. This was a room that factory management used for their kind of relaxation. There was just a big sofa. The hole in the wall was all used for a big TV and Dolby surround system. There was some workout tools. I think there was a mahjong table in there, etc. And when we got there and looked at the factory, when we're normally looking around, is there any space? Where is a safe space? We have a lot of criteria that the factories need to fulfill. Obviously, they cannot do it on the production floor. We saw this room and said, honestly, this would be perfect because it also had a garden outside where kids can actually play. And so the management was ready to give up their kind of space that they had for themselves, and within a week transformed it into what now looks much more like a kindergarten. The second big, I would say, emerging of child labor, and that's not actually a new thing, it's just that we start to see that many companies starting to look beyond the first tier, because many companies realize that's where we have the real risk. We worked with a company who actually in the headquarters in Europe did an assessment and said, where do we have risks in terms of child rights in our activities? And one of the areas that I identified as a high-risk area was their kind of hidden supply chain. So we're pretty sure that in our first-tier factories we have no to very, very, very little incidents of child labor. But we do think we don't know it all, and potentially there is more to our supply chain that we see. And what we did, we sat down with them and said, okay, where do you have the particular risks? And it was actually fairly easy to do, and it's part of the mapping processes that you can do a bit more systematically. But in this case, we just sat down and said, what products of you are particularly at risk to
to be produced in places where you might not have the conditions that you're expecting. We identified two kind of products. One was the very low cost products within their portfolio that had very, very low margins, where we know the price pressure is particularly strong, both from the merchandisers within the company towards their suppliers, but also from the consumers who are buying those things. And in this case, we looked at what is called, they call it holiday toys, or pocket money toys. So it's toys that cost just a couple, maybe €1 or €2, if at all. It's toys that people buy. So, for example, a jumping spider for Halloween would go into this production, or a little snowman that lights for Christmas. These are toys that often children buy with their pocket money, and they're used to attract children into toy stores to see the bigger things they want for Christmas. So there's a big price pressure on those toys. And after singling out this category, we looked at the different suppliers, and we saw one supplier who was supplying 43 different products in that year. He was in the system for 43 different products, and just by looking at the products, it got very quickly obvious that there's a lot of different production procedures involved in these products. Now, on the suppliers list, there was one factory, that was Factory A, that was named as being the factory where those things are done. And it got very quickly obvious that there's no way this Factory A is doing those 43 different products, because there was some sewing involved, there was a kind of a plush little duck that squeaked when you squeeze it, etc. There was a lot of other processes like plating involved. So very quickly we could say there's a risk here. And we did a bit of this investigative work with also pressuring that supplier quite a bit. So he had to be kind of threatened with termination, that if he wouldn't reveal if you wouldn't be transparent in this process. We went to Factory A. Now, Factory A, by the way, is one of those factories that will tell you that they get 6 to 7 audits a year. Now, so that comes close to the number that you mentioned before for the Gap factory. Now, the reason, or my suspicion is, the reason they get so many audits is because a lot of people got them on their lists as their first-tier manufacturers. But they are actually a small factory, 60 people that do some toys, but it's kind of high-end toys that I do for the American market. That it was not the things that we were looking at, what we thought they were done. When we did workers interviews, workers did not recognize any of the products from that company. And by digging deeper, we found out, well, nothing was done there. This company was just, the boxes just went through there, and the quality controller just looked at the boxes in that factory. It turned out that then they said, well, we have a second factory. That's actually where it's done. And we went to look at this factory, and we found out that this factory had at least another 8 subcontractors. And that's not sub-suppliers. That's not component suppliers. That's people where who did those toys. They just came through the factory for packaging, and then went into the Factory A for quality control. So basically what was kind of one, brand supplier factory turned out to be an operation that involved 31. So we could also track down to 21 component factories. Some of that had components with the name of that particular brand on it. In those 31, we only could trace some information of 55%. For the other ones, we couldn't get an address, we couldn't get a phone number. It was really like being a policeman or trying to do discover a crime. From the 17s where we had data, we did kind of a sampling of 6 factories and went to visit those 6 factories. Were very hard to trace, and sometimes all those factories had double names and different addresses, and we basically just drove around looking for those factories. What we found was unfortunately not very good. In 5 out of the 6, we found minimum 1 to mostly 2, what we would call, for this company, were zero tolerance issues. Child labor, underpayment of wages, of minimum wage, and even including the overtime, the workers didn't receive a minimum wage. And I think nearly in all of them, they had dormitories in the production areas. There were a lot of social compliance issues with excessive working hours, temporary workers that didn't have contracts or no social insurance, and health and safety issues were very, very common. The child labor issue, so one of the factories, and this is also where the picture here is from, we went in there, we saw about 21 children. Some of them were 16. Some of them were 14, some of them were 15. We could at least track it down to 4 children who were 14 or 15. And what was really striking is the picture you saw, sorry, here. That was their dormitory. It was right next to a garbage dump. We could just walk in. There was no locks. There was a security guard, but he didn't care. We just could walk in. We could go into the dormitories of those children. They had no locks. They had no privacy. Those girls who were 15, 16 years of age were totally unprotected. And this is in Shenzhen, about an hour from Shenzhen downtown. So it's not like in some hidden corner of China. And so, same thing with this boy. I think he is 14. But even the children who were 16, they all didn't have any contracts. Most of them worked 7 days, 10 hours a day, with wages that were under the minimum wage. And what was kind of striking is that they were from minority areas of China. Their Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, was quite bad. Many of them could not really speak it. And when we asked, how did you find this factory, everybody told us that it was the uncle who works here. But the uncle was from Guizhou, I think, whereas the kids were from Yunnan and Sichuan area, so he probably was not an uncle. And we really had to suspect that there was some sort of trafficking involved as well to bring 21 children, very vulnerable children, to this area in Shenzhen. And you don't find a factory when you're walking around. It's not a factory. You go up and say, can I have a job, please? So just quickly talking about what the company then decided to do about it. It came, as you can imagine, quite as a shock. They thought they had some risk. They didn't thought it would be quite as bad. For one thing, we really mapped, in particular for these toys, some of the issues. We mapped which tier was the highest level, so we looked at the compliance risks, but we also looked at the reputational risk. So for example, is it traceable? Like, does it have your company name on it? Is your packaging involved, etc.? And there, it's from a reputational risk, obviously much higher. But then there is a compliance risk and the risk for the people involved. In this case, also for the children involved. We could also identify some processes, for example, oil painting, plating, and printing. That actually, in this, turned out to be the process with the highest risk scores, both in terms of social compliance as well as in terms of reputational. We saw that there were high, like say, health and safety, or the processes that have higher health and safety risks were outsourced. So basically what they did, they gave spray painting to workers. So workers would leave home with a basket full of products and sprays, and spray in their dormitory with no protection, etc. And like that, they, again, when they had audits, could kind of get away with it because they didn't have the spraying process within their factory. So what we did, and what we're still in the process to do is really, so they now know their risks, and we looked at what are the root causes to why did you end up with such a supply chain. And we identified a couple of intrinsic challenges that they have. For example, merchandising teams that are only focused on price. Merchandising teams where price is everything, and that's their own KPI. So I'm going to get a bonus if I do a good job in finding the lowest price factory, and that's all I need to care about. Whereas there is no incentive whatsoever that if I go and visit a factory, and I might think something is a bit fishy, to call it out. Because I'm just making trouble for myself and just going to make my workday longer, but there's no incentive for that. We realized that quality inspectors could have figured this out 4 years ago, because when we started to talk to them, it turned out they never saw production. They only saw boxes. They always had to wait for the boxes, so alarm bells should have gone up. But they didn't think it was their task within the company to call it out. So we're working with them on identifying these root causes, but also on being prepared, because another thing was that finding this child labor, the company realized we don't know what to do now. We don't have a system in place. We don't have any budgets for child labor remediation. So can we actually do something about this? And then obviously making the necessary changes. And in this case, it's really changes within the procedure. It's really how the company operates, what the tasks of each staff are. Okay, so the last emerging risk, and I'm going to cut this a little bit short, is school dropout rates. As we know, most of the child labor in Asia is not 8, 9 years old. When we've seen 8, 9 years old, it was this children on the work floor issue that we talked about first. Most of the times when people are really hired, they're 13, 14, or even 15 in China, where the minimum age is 16. One reason is that we have a big vocational school program in China, where vocational schools are the driver for child labor, because they're sending children that are sometimes under the age of 16 into factories to work under the kind of coverage of internships. The IT sector had a big issue with that, but we've just last year had a case where we've had 5 children in one textile factory, and they were all coming through a vocational school where there were no classes. It was just basically, the school was just a covered up agency. We also know from a recent very interesting study that was done by Huawei, you can find it I think on Huawei's website, about challenges in getting completion of one of the SDGs for 2030 to have basically full coverage of secondary school for all children in Asia, and they looked at that. And for example, in Myanmar, where we're working, you can see that there are huge dropout rates in secondary school. And that's kind of a tendency we see in many places. So we're doing it also in China very, very well in primary school. And most children really stay in school until the age of 13, 14, but that's when dropout rates start to hit. And then once they reach 16, then dropout rates are particularly high. And in most of the countries, there's very little alternative program. There's no apprenticeship programs. There's little good vocational schools. And that really creates a whole population of people who are out there not going to school and basically looking for work, and potentially looking for work either in hazardous environments or looking for work before they reach the legal working age. This is also related to the issue of left behind children that we have in many of the countries, as I mentioned before, because those children who are looked after by grandparents, they tend to kind of or grandparents often seem to have a much harder time to then look after the children once they turn 12, 13, right? It's okay when they're small, but the solution doesn't hold very well when school is not so much fun anymore. And kids often have to be pushed to stay into school, or they might not just go if nobody tells them to go. They might just stay home, because often we have also issues with quality of schooling. So we really see a correlation here. So when we're working with child labor in China, the majority of those children have grown up without their parents. They might have been with an uncle or with grandparents, etc. But it's not that every left behind child will drop out of school and become a child laborer, but those who do, often it's related to the fact that the families surrounding them were just not strong enough to kind of protect them from getting into the labor market at a very early age. I think what we see as best practices is really companies who invest into youth development. We see as a kind of not best practice, I would say, companies who just say, because I don't want child labor, I'm not ever going to hire anyone who's 16, because then I'm increasing my risk of child labor. So I'm just making 18 is the cut, and nobody should get into our factories or in our suppliers' factories under the age of 18. Now, we actually, from our perspective as a child rights organization, think that's not very helpful, because it keeps opportunities away from youth who might need it the most. Potentially, your suppliers' factories are the better factories. They're potentially the better places to work than some informal sweatshop in Bangladesh, right? But if we're keeping the young, like in Bangladesh, the minimum working age is 14. If we're now keeping all the 14 years old out of the good factories, they won't have any opportunity, and they will end up in in the informal factories where they have no protections, no contracts, etc., and when where they are clearly in hazardous conditions. So we're working with companies. IKEA is a company who's really trying to drive good, protected opportunities for youth from the age of 14 in very specific projects. You need to do it right, otherwise you have other issues. But if it's done right, we think it's a very good tool against children 14, 15 in hazardous working conditions. So to recap, children on the work floor, we do think it is, in particular in China, going to continue to be a higher risk, and potentially you'll find it in audits. And we do find there's very easy ways to deal with that by supporting migrant parents, and we've seen many companies doing so. More companies will dig deeper, will go beyond first year. Companies need to be ready for the findings and the things they might see when they do so. Things that we thought we've kind of got over with might pop up again once we go to second, third tier factories. And so being ready for this is definitely a good investment. And the third, we encourage companies, and we've seen many companies doing it, supporting youth in and outside the factories in order to create opportunities for youth and avoid youth ending up in hazardous conditions. So that was it from me for now.